They're the conversations happening all over the country: race, policing, how our leaders handle it, and how our local communities are reacting. Plus, a look ahead at next week's GOP convention. Please stay with us. My Week starts right now.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there and welcome to My Week. I'm Christy McDonald, and what a week it has been. From the deaths of African-American men at the hands of police, to the killing of 5 police officers in Dallas, to Black Lives Matter, to All Lives Matter, we have all found ourselves in conversations this week, our emotions reeling about our country and examining where we go from here. In communities across Michigan, there is focus on policing and supporting police. In Detroit, 4 people arrested for making threats on social media against cops. A Detroit officer reprimanded for his own rant against Black Lives Matter on social media, and rallies for peace and better understanding. We'll look specifically at our area's reaction, plus changes in the Detroit Police Department coming off of federal oversight. Also, one state rep wants to classify violent crimes against police officers as hate crimes, and we'll also look at the role of leadership and how our country moves forward from all of this. There is a lot to get to tonight with our My Week contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Guys, it's great to see you this week, especially after everything that is happened. And I guess I want to just first get your take in terms of what are some of the conversations that you've had with people this week in the aftermath of everything that we've seen, Nolan?
Well, I think there's a sense by people that the country's coming apart. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this probably since the civil rights and anti-war protests of the 60s, where, people are actually getting killed in the process of protest and in the clash of ideals and what have you. I think there's a lot of people are worried about the country and its status, where it's headed. There's a great deal of concern about this.
And I think it's interesting, too, because I've spent some time on social media, and Stephen, I know you have as well, and posting a lot about this. I mean, and I find getting into weird conversations with people, some bizarre takes, and a lot of people are forming their opinions about how they feel about where the country is, to Nolan's point, based on maybe experiences their parents have had. It has really brought up a lot of raw conversations that I think that people sometimes don't even know where to go with this.
Yeah, well, I think that's actually a good thing, right? Raw emotion and honest articulation of those emotions are part of the place you start, because for a long time we haven't been honest about what goes on in this country, what this country is like if you are African American, what this country is like, even worse, if you are poor and African American, and getting people to see that, getting people to hear that and engage with it is an important first step. I mean, as an African American, as someone who hears lots from African Americans, I think fear is the word and the emotion that you hear the most. I mean, there is no good reason for somebody like me, who is not a criminal, who is a person of means, to be afraid of what might happen if the police pull me over. These videos that we've now seen for 3 years running, which expose something that's been happening for a long time, make that much more palpable. Makes it much more palpable when I think about my 12-year-old son, who's starting to look and act like more of an adult. I think you got to start the conversation there and start thinking about what are the things we need to do to change the way that police interact with African Americans, and the way the rest of the country thinks of us and our community and our lives. What value do they actually have?
Do you feel, though, that there still is this us versus them mentality that has come out, and then after the shootings of the police officers, Nolan, even more of a line?
Well, I would hope not, because the last thing this country needs is a race war, and I'm a little worried about the escalation of the rhetoric. I think Steve's right. We need to discuss this thing. We need to examine policing and tactics and training, but most cops aren't racist, and there's not a systemic war on African American men by the police departments. There have been some horrible incidents, but as the police chief in Dallas said, when the shooting started, these officers ran to protect the public, and that's what they do every day for very low pay and at risk of their lives. And so we've got to be careful not to demonize them, not to put targets on their back. And one thing the Black Lives Matter has done, I mean, it certainly has raised awareness of this issue, but the rhetoric has been sometimes a little too incendiary. I think you don't need folks marching down the street shouting, you know, what do we want? Dead cops. It's dangerous, and we've seen how the impact rhetoric has had on people who are mentally unstable. We saw that in Charleston, for example. We saw that in other places. We've got to be careful with the language and with the tactics we use. It's a serious issue. We need to address it seriously.
Okay, so you say now, Stephen, and both of you, Nolan, say that we've had more conversation now, and people are very aware, and we've got to be honestly open and talking about this. But what does that get us? What does the talking about it really get us at this point? And again, to your point, you've said for the last 3 years we've seen videos, we've seen incidences happening saying we've got to do something to change this. So I'm wondering now, are we at this point where who's going to take the lead on some kind of action?
I think that's a really important question, to move from talking to some action. And there are some points where we have the opportunity to do that. You think about what happened in Ferguson after the shooting of Michael Brown and all the conflict there between police and the African American community. The Justice Department came in and documented what goes on in that department, talked about how often African Americans are pulled over for apparently no reason, written tickets for apparently no reason, how they had created a culture of criminalization around blackness, essentially, in that town, that pushed things to the point where someone like Michael Brown sets off this clash between police and the African American community. I think interceding in this at that point, getting at the driving while black, right? How often are African Americans pulled over for things that you never pull white people over for? And you know, you got to be honest about this stuff. Police officers know that there is a culture and there is a systemic issue in a lot of departments about the way that you deal with minority communities. We have to start thinking about ways to make that look different.
All right, so in the aftermath of all of this, all the major cities are being looked at, Nolan. So of course everyone's looking at Detroit saying, all right, what's happening in Detroit? Could something like this happen in Detroit?
It could happen anywhere, because you get somebody goes off their nut, and I mean, people get shot by police in Detroit quite regularly. Now, we haven't had sort of the same dramatic, unjustified, questionable shootings here that we've had in other places, but I mean, a lot of people get shot by police. A lot of white people get shot by police every year. Half the people killed by police are white. And I think we have to start taking a hard look at the use of lethal force when it's appropriate. I mean, ideally, that should be a very last resort. And, you know, we need to examine whether that's true or whether it's become too easy to use the gun.
Well,
and also,
it's also this idea, you know, the police escalate these incidents. You think about pulling someone over for a taillight and you get to the point where you're shooting them. You think about stopping somebody from selling CDs outside a store. How do you get to the point where you're now rolling on the ground, wrestling with this person? It's the police who escalate too many of these incidents to the place where lethal force is even on the table.
And you've made a point about oversight, and Detroit police is just coming out of oversight from the Justice Department after a number of years, and
they changed a lot of things.
And they did. And Chief James Craig, he talked to us a short time ago, talking about the department coming out and an emphasis on community policing. I want you to go ahead and take a listen to that.
When I assumed command here some 2.5 years ago, I would tell you that police-community relations were at the bottom. People have lost confidence in this police department. The City of Detroit Police Department was under a consent decree for 13 years, the second longest running consent judgment in this country. Now, we look at what we've done with fewer officers, how we've restored trust and transparency. And I believe that the initiative, Neighborhood Police Officers, has really made a difference in bridging that gap.
So coming out of this oversight, Nolan, do you believe that that Detroit is in a better place maybe than a lot of other cities?
Well, I think they're in a better place because they got a police chief who understands the importance of community relations, and he's doing a lot of things to build trust with the community, but also to work with his officers, training on tactics and what have you, to minimize the possibility that would happen here. Same in Dallas. You have a police chief who is aware of the need to change tactics and to work with the community. I think all over the country now you have police departments looking at themselves and trying to figure this out. I think, again, one thing we can't have here is police feeling like they're a target, they're under siege. It's only going to make them more defensive, more fearful. And I mean, you talk about being fearful as a black man being stopped by police. The cops are fearful too. And I think that combination
But
sometimes
the distinction is a
volatile.
really important distinction there, right? Cops are trained and employed to be in fearful situations and to react without escalating those incidents. That's their job. African Americans don't
human.
have that same burden.
They're human, Steve.
And
fear is fear.
It is unreasonable to sort of, I think, compare civilians who are being targeted because of the color of their skin to professionals who are trained to de-escalate those situations. And that's what's not happening.
And I'm not comparing it, Steve, but I'm saying you have to be realistic. These are human beings.
Understood.
They're underpaid. They're in stressful situations. They get frightened the same as anyone else. And I think it's a very dangerous atmosphere when you have both folks frightened in an encounter.
What about leadership and tone in terms of, I mean, you talked about the police chief in Dallas, and we just heard from Chief Craig. How big of a difference does that make in leading a police force like this and trying to institute some of these changes?
I mean, I think Chief Craig deserves an awful lot of credit for the change in demeanor and relationship between the police and the community here in Detroit. We still have problems. There's a group now that's talking about officer-involved incidents and the number of them. You're always going to have some of that. I think there's a whole lot less of it now because of the Justice Department intervention in Detroit and the things that we have changed. It's a model of some sorts for some of these other places. I think in some of these other departments, one of the things you do have, though, is this mismatch of culture in the police and the community. How many African Americans are on forces in cities where you have large African American populations? How many of them live in the communities that they're policing and understand the things that go on and how to deal with them? I mean, I think Detroit looks a lot different in that way than a lot of other places, and until you can start thinking about a national way to get other departments in that same space, we're going to have this problem.
Nolan, this week a state rep said they want to classify violent crimes against police officers as hate crimes. Do you believe that is legislation that we need here in Michigan?
No, I mean, I'm not a big supporter of the whole hate crime designation. A crime's a crime. You shoot a cop, I mean, that's first-degree murder. I mean, if you're convicted, I think it's grandstanding, it's showboating to add that extra layer. I think you deal with the crime. It's tragic for a cop to die. It's tragic for any individual to be shot and killed or to be murdered. I don't think you get into classifications of victims. You just prosecute the crime.
What do you think?
I'm not a big fan of those. I mean, the irony here is that in some states, in many states, in death penalty states, killing a cop is an automatic enhancement to get a capital charge. In Louisiana, for instance, where you saw two cops shoot a guy lying on the ground, if that situation were reversed, the person who did it would be absolutely charged with capital murder. I think that mismatch is troubling. This would exacerbate it here in Michigan, but I don't like hate crimes legislation. I think we have aggravators and things already built into the law to deal with different situations. We got to talk about making everybody's lives equal. Black people's lives don't matter as much as other people's lives in these communities and in this country. And until we're willing to say that and start dealing with why that's true and how we move to a different space, all of this other stuff is academic.
It's interesting too. I think I would also like to advance the conversation as well in looking at, how we're talking to kids about race and how we deal with each other, because we're talking a lot about legislation and the Justice Department and policing and different things. But I find that attitudes that children have right now, they pick up a lot from their parents. And so I want the larger conversation also to continue to be, what are we teaching now our youngest generation? And I've thought a lot about that this week as I've been explaining to my 3 children what they've been seeing on the news, first starting with the shootings and then what happened in Dallas, and having these larger conversations. Nolan, what do you think?
Well, I think these younger generations are worlds ahead in terms of racial understanding, racial acceptance, race relations than previous generations. The conversation you had with your children, did you have those with your parents when you were growing up?
No.
I mean, so I think we're well ahead, and I think there's hope for the future because the kids are interacting more with each other than past generations ever did. There's more conversation, there's more understanding. I don't think there'll be near as much racism and misunderstanding in coming generations than there were in past, but it's a long process.
You know, I hope not, and I think because when you have kids that are very well integrated into school systems that have a very diverse population, that's a good thing. I'm afraid that when they get older, they start listening or they're hearing things from parents or seeing different things that they all of a sudden, start to change a little bit. Stephen, what would you say?
Well, I mean, I think this is something that's gone on for African Americans for centuries, right? My mother had to sit down with me when I started going out on my own, when I started driving, and talk about what it means to be a young black man in this country, and that things were going to happen because of that, and particularly with the police. When I was 16 years old driving around Detroit in a new car, I would get stopped all the time and asked, where'd I get the money for it? Then they want to toss the car looking for money and things like that.
You're a pretty lousy driver, too.
No question, I had tickets. These are old issues for the African American community. I think the fact that white families are now seeing it, and I think talking more about it is a great thing. But in the black community, this is life. This is life in this country, and it has been forever. And what's sad and disappointing is that it's not different enough from what my parents might have dealt with, or my grandparents in much different times. The fact that I have to now sit down with my son at age 12 and 13 and talk about these things the way I was talked to when I was a kid, it's difficult. It's very hard.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. On Monday, the Republican convention starts in Cleveland, and already this week, Republicans are shaping their platform and finalizing the rules. It promises to be fascinating, with the Dump Trump group still trying to think of a last-minute way to block Donald Trump's nomination. The Democrats, they're watching this, too, as this week Bernie Sanders gave his tepid support to Hillary Clinton. This has been a very interesting week, also coming off of everything that we have just talked about as well. And there's some new polls out that have tightened the race significantly. We'll get to that. But I want to start off with the convention, because Nolan, you are going to Cleveland and you're going to be there all week.
He's going to the parties, at least.
Well,
If I get to them.
he'll really have a finger on the pulse of what's happening at the convention.
I'll FaceTime you from the Leonard Skinner concert.
Please do. Please do.
That's something, that's a reality show waiting to happen. Nolan goes to the convention. So why don't you go ahead and give us an idea of how you think this is all shaping up?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of question marks about next week, both inside and outside the convention hall. I do believe the Dump Trump movement has petered out. I think it'll get a last test over the next couple days in the Rules Committee.
Why do you think it petered out?
Well, it didn't get the sort of leadership support it would have needed to prevail. I mean, you had the leaders of the party didn't get behind it, or not enough of them, and not enough money got behind it. And it's just not going to happen. I think, I was part of that Dump Trump crowd, but we've lost. And I think there's going to be one last gasp. So the challenge for the party inside that convention, and if you talk to Republican leadership, is to come out of there united in some form. And if you can't unite people behind the candidate fully, then you have to at least unite them behind the party, because they're very worried about what's going to happen down ballot if this feud, if this split is still there coming out of Cleveland.
You've been to how many conventions now?
These next two will be my 9th and 10th, I think.
And so going into this, I know you prepare always every time that you go. What is your, I guess, your feeling going into this? Because everyone I talk to, they're like, well, this is going to be crazy, or this is, this is
And they both- I
amazing.
think
But
both
kind
conventions
of give me
will.
what your gut sense is of what you're going to see in terms of, have you ever seen any feeling like this coming out of the conservative movement?
Or on the Democratic side, either one. I've never seen an election season like this. Normally you go into convention wondering what in the heck you're going to write about, because they're all so prepackaged and ready to deliver. And they go in with the goal of having no news made at the convention. And this time, you don't know what's going to happen on the streets in either place. You've got a lot of people talking about Cleveland. My experience with conventions is that more protesters show up for Democratic conventions. I mean, they have a larger fringe, with expectations of the party that they feel aren't met, and so you get a lot of activity in a normal year. This year, will these disappointed Sanders folks show up and mess things up? Will the anarchists who show up every time, everywhere, be in larger force? Will Black Lives Movement come out and disrupt things in the streets, either in Cleveland or in Philadelphia? So this time you don't know whether what happens outside the convention hall is going to overwhelm or grind to a halt what goes on inside.
I was just going to say, there's only so much the Republicans control at this point, Stephen. But if you are part of the Republican Party, what would you say that you have to show the rest of America? Because the knock has been the Republicans are only getting white male voters right now, that you've got to reach out to Latino voters and you have to reach out to women. So as a Republican Party as a whole, what do you have to give off this week
So
to
in any
attract
presidential
people?
campaign after the primaries, you only get a certain number of opportunities as the candidate and the party to have national attention, right? Everybody's attention all at once to make your case to the voters. One is, of course, your convention. The other 2 or 3 are the whatever debates they decide to have in the fall. If you don't take advantage of those, you can't win in many instances. And for Donald Trump, who already starts out, as you point out, behind with important constituencies that nobody can win the presidency without significant support from, that doubles the stakes next week. It makes the potential chaos at the convention more dangerous and damaging to his effort. I mean, you think about if you have this sort of fight at the Republican convention and then unity at the Democratic convention the next week, what the polls will look like in early August, when if the Democrats get their act together and the Republicans look chaotic.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's important. It's important for the Republicans to get their act together. How important is the VP pick for Trump? Because he's supposed to announce it Friday.
I'm never a big believer. I think the only times that it makes a difference is when you get it completely wrong, as McCain did with Sarah Palin. I think if you pick a standard issue Republican or a standard issue Democrat, if it's Tim Kaine, if it's Mike Pence or Newt Gingrich. Gingrich might be a little distracting, but it doesn't matter that much. This is all about the candidate. And you talked about white male voters. I think Hillary Clinton's instincts would have gone to a Hispanic or a minority running mate, but that's a party, just as the Republicans have trouble with minorities, this is a party that's losing white male voters, and that's not an insignificant voting group, and you can't simply write them off and say, well, they don't matter. They could cause losing that group could cause, particularly the union members, and the party has lost a good number of its blue-collar base.
Democrats haven't won that demographic since the early 60s. The number has been around 34%, right? Bill Clinton got 34% of the white male vote. Barack Obama, in both elections, got those same numbers. She doesn't have to do any better than that.
She can't do much worse.
She can't do worse.
No, and she can't be too pleased with a lot of the new polls that are coming out. An NBC poll shows that Ohio is in a dead heat.
Yeah, right.
The CBS poll, New York Times poll out this morning shows in general that race is a dead heat. And Bernie Sanders, while he was like, I'm for Hillary, he was
Yeah, you
it
still
was
have a
uncomfortable.
real problem on that side of the ledger, getting everybody under the same flag, right, and saying we're all gonna go together after Donald Trump.
And if she goes to her convention and pulls too far left to get those Sanders voters,
she loses
then she's losing a lot of the independence that she has to have to win this thing. You know, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the horse race polls right now. This isn't a popular vote election. These are electoral college elections.
Well, which I think, but it was also interesting because it was coming off of the no charges, no indictment for Hillary Clinton,
why
and
people are
it does
upset.
speak to the thought that people have in terms of her trustworthiness and that sort of thing. So that's why I think some of these polls are significant.
Well, I mean, and that's not. I don't think those issues are going to go away. And so,
But you
know,
still
she's
have
got
these,
to.
Yeah, I mean, this is an
Yeah.
anomalous election in terms of polls. You look at a state like Utah being within 10 points. That's craziness for Republicans. You look at Arizona and North Carolina being in play. Those are solidly
But
Republican.
you still have a lot of key battleground states in play according to these polls. So I'm not sure anybody can make.
And we'll see just how much these conventions are going to make a difference. All right, guys, that is going to do it. That's going to do it for my week. Thanks so much for joining us. Remember, Nolan, he'll be at the convention next week in Cleveland, and he'll hook up with us on the next My Week and fill us in. Make sure you check out My Week on Facebook and on Twitter. I'm Christy McDonald. Thanks so much for supporting Detroit Public Television. We will see you next time. Take care.
Did you know? Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago. In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.